Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. It's Alaysia here, and boy has it been a while. I have no makeup on. Anyone who knows me knows that I am obsessed with learning about like true crime and serial killers and like cold cases and everything like that, and I'm also like crazy obsessed with makeup too. But when I try to do tutorials like I did the beginning of last year, they don't work for me. I'm not really good at explaining what I'm doing while I'm doing it. So I watch Alaysia Marea, and she does Murder Mystery Makeup Mondays, and I wanted to do something like that. But I have no clue like what to name the series, so if you have any suggestions, please leave those in the comments down below. If you see me squinting, I'm supposed to be wearing glasses, but I can't wear glasses and do my makeup at the same time. So anyway, if you couldn't tell by the title of the video, today we are talking about Ted Bundy. And Ted Bundy was one of the first serial killers I ever learned about. I was supposed to film this video in April of last year when that Netflix movie came out. It just never happened. We're just going to get into the video. Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24th, 1946. His mother's name was Eleanor Louise Cowell. She was a teen mom. She was pretty young when she had Ted. I couldn't find her exact age though. His biological father is unknown, so he has his mom's last name. Ted spent the first 3 or 4 months of his life over 400 miles away from his family. Eleanor lived with her parents in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Bundy stayed at a place called the Lund Family Center. This was located in Burlington, Vermont. It was founded in 1890, and it was a place for women to go and give birth in secret and quietly so that it didn't ruin their social standing. So Ted was raised by the nurses and the caregivers at the Lund Family Center, and it was rumored or believed that Eleanor initially intended to give Ted up for adoption, but it was insisted that she bring him home. Now, I'm not sure if it was insisted that she bring him home by her family or by the people at the Lund Family Center. I just know either way, she was encouraged to bring Ted home. Ted's grandparents then took on the role of father and mother, and Eleanor took on the role of his older sister, though everyone around them in the neighborhood and in the family knew that this was Eleanor's son. They all agreed that Ted was a very handsome boy with dark brown eyes and curly brown hair, and Eleanor tried taking care of Ted as much as she could. But it was difficult. She was younger. She was taking on the role of his sister. She tried to make sure that he was put into bed on time, and she took him to a local Methodist church on Sundays. Eleanor did try to bond with Ted because it was her son, but there was always a separation between them. Ted had clung to his grandfather that he thought was his father, which is normal for a young boy to cling to their father, but he clung to his grandfather despite disturbing behaviors that he showed. So Sam Cowell was Eleanor's mom. This was Ted's grandfather, and he was feared by a lot of people. He was said to be a terrifying man with an abusive personality. People would see him kicking neighborhood dogs, swinging stray cats by their tails. He brutally tormented his family, and people often caught him shouting at no one in particular, which led a lot of people to believe that Sam was mentally ill. Ted's Aunt Julia, Eleanor's sister, noticed disturbing behaviors right away, like right when he was younger. When he was 3 years old, she woke up in the family home to see Ted smiling down at her, holding a kitchen knife. So that's a little bit strange. By the time that Ted was 4 years old, Eleanor took him to move in with family in Tacoma, Washington, and they moved because Sam was very abusive towards Eleanor and Ted. They moved in with Ted's great uncle Jack. So this was Eleanor's uncle in Tacoma, Washington. Eleanor thought that she was getting Ted out of like a dysfunctional family, but unfortunately at this point the damage had already been done and Ted had created a role model from his grandfather. Their Uncle Jack was a pretty wealthy man. He was able to send his kids to boarding schools overseas, and this caused Ted to resent his wealthy family. He began to resent his wealthy family even more when his mom married a middle-class working man named Johnny Bundy. It was said that Eleanor was Ted's first disappointment in life. Ted was never able to get away from both needing her and being repelled by her. And growing up in the 1950s, Ted wanted nothing more than to just fit in and be a clean-cut, modest young man. But they say friends, but he didn't really have friends. A lot of classmates said that Ted was quick-tempered, that he couldn't avoid confrontation, and that he was often seen in class clenching his fists. And after school, he would always be seen riding his bike around the neighborhood alone. So Ted was sort of a loner. He didn't really have friends. My makeup looks freaking awful. During his preteen years is when Ted started showing even more disturbing behaviors. He had questions about sex like every teenager does, but he didn't have anyone that he trusted enough to go to about his questions. So he started looking through neighbors' trash cans for pornographic magazines, and he used these magazines to answer his questions about women. And when this wasn't enough, he would go out at night and go around the neighborhood and start looking through the windows of women who lived nearby. And at one point, he almost got beat up in school because he tried to pull down the pants of a girl and feel her up when no one was looking. And her brother was not too happy about that. Ted had a very hard time trying to converse with women in high school, but by the time he went to college, he learned that he did not need to talk to women to get what he wanted from them. So violent fantasies of controlling women and forcing them to obey his desires became very, very normal for Ted. In 1965, Ted graduated high school and he spent a year at the University of Puget Sound when he then transferred to the University of Washington in 1966 to study Chinese. Then in 1967, he got romantically involved with a classmate at the University of Washington who was identified as Stephanie Brooks. So in 1968, he dropped out of college and he worked a series of minimum wage jobs, and he also volunteered at the Seattle office of Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign. He became Arthur Fletcher's driver and bodyguard during Fletcher's campaign for lieutenant governor of Washington State, And in August of that year, he attended the 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami as a Rockefeller delegate. Shortly after that, Brooks ended their relationship abruptly. She returned home to her family in California, and it was said that the reason she broke up with him was because of Ted's immaturity and lack of ambition. Psychiatrist Dorothy Lewis pinpointed this as probably the pivotal point in Bundy's development. Devastated by Brooks's rejection, Bundy then traveled to Colorado and then farther east, visiting his family in Arkansas and Philadelphia. Then he attended Temple University in Philadelphia. In fall of 1969, he was back in Washington, and he met Elizabeth Klopfer. She is often identified in Bundy literacy as May Anders, Beth Archer, or Liz Kendall. She was a divorcee from Ogden, Utah, and she was a secretary at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Their relationship would continue well past Bundy's initial incarceration in 1976. In the mid-1970s, I don't have an exact date or time frame. It was in the middle of 1970. He re-enrolled at the University of Washington as a psychology major, and he became an honor student and was well regarded by his professors. In 1971, he got a job at Seattle's suicide hotline crisis center, and he met and worked alongside Ann Rule, who was a former Seattle police officer and was an aspiring crime writer. Rule later said that she saw nothing really strange about Bundy, that he was a kind and empathetic young man. In 1972, Ted graduated from the University of Washington. I believe his degree was still in psychology, and he joined Governor Daniel J. Evans' re-election campaign, and he actually went and posed as a college student and followed around Evans' opponent, who was the former governor named Albert Rossellini. He recorded Albert's speeches and took them back to Evans' team for evaluation and analysis. Bundy was hired as an assistant to Ross Davis, and Ross Davis was the chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. Early 1973, Bundy was accepted into the law schools of the University of Puget Sound and the University of Utah. In the summer of 1973, he took a trip to California on Republican Party business, and he rekindled his relationship with Stephanie Brooks. At this time, he is still dating Klopfer, and neither woman was aware of these others' existence, because why would they be? In January of 1974, Bundy abruptly cut off all contact with Brooks. All of her phone calls went unreturned, and she finally reached him by phone a month later, and she demanded to know why Bundy ended things, because at this point her and Bundy were engaged while he's still dating Elizabeth Klopfer. And he said in a flat, calm voice, "Stephanie, I have no idea what you mean," and he hung up the phone. He said, "I just wanted to prove to myself that I could have married her." Brooks then concluded that it was probably all set up, the whole courtship and everything, to get back at her for her rejecting him in the past. By this point, Ted began skipping classes at law school, and then by April he had stopped attending altogether. And now we're gonna get into the stuff that you guys are probably here for, which is the murders, and there's a lot. January 4th, 1974, Bundy's first attack was not an actual murder, but it was an assault on 18-year-old Karen Spark. Karen was a student and dancer at the University of Washington, and Bundy had broken into her apartment, took a metal rod from her bed frame, bludgeoned her unconscious, sexually assaulted her with that same object, causing extensive internal injuries, and Karen was left in a 10-day coma and had permanent disabilities. Around a month later, Bundy broke into the apartment of another University of Washington student, and her name was Linda Ann Healy. He knocked her unconscious, clothed her, and carried her out to his car, and she was never seen again. That's all we really know about her. Bundy then began targeting other female students in the Washington area, and he would do this by using crutches or having a cast on his arm, coming up to them politely and asking for assistance with carrying something to his car. In the spring and summer of 1974, police in the Pacific Northwest were in a panic because female students were disappearing at an alarming rate all across Washington and Oregon, and law enforcement had very few leads as to who could have been behind it. These students included Donna Gail Manson, Suzanne Elaine Rancourt, Roberta Kathleen Parks, Brenda Carol Ball, and Georgianne Hawkins. With all of the women, Bundy had bludgeoned them unconscious before binding, raping, and killing them. He dumped their bodies in remote locations in the woods, and he would revisit these sites to have sex with their decaying corpses. In some cases, he would decapitate his victims and keep their skulls in his apartment, sleeping beside his trophies. The disappearances all took place at night, and they all took place near ongoing construction work because you can't hear as much. They were all within a week of midterms or final exams. All the victims were wearing either slacks or blue jeans. All of the disappearances included the sighting of a man with a cast or sling, and a man driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. And now I'm going to talk about each of those previously mentioned girls individually. So first was Donna Gail Manson. She was a 19-year-old student and attended the Evergreen State College in Olympia. She left her dormitory to attend a jazz concert and never returned. And then about a month later, on April 17th, Suzanne Elaine Rancourt disappeared while on her way to her dorm room after an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg. Two female Central Washington students later came forward to report encounters, one of the night of Rancourt's disappearance and the other one of 3 nights earlier, and both of these encounters included a man with his arm in a sling asking for help carrying a load of books to his brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. On May 6th, Roberta Kathleen Parks left her dormitory in Oregon State University in Corvallis to have coffee with her friends at Memorial Union, but never arrived. On June 1st, Brenda Carol Ball, who was 22 at the time, disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien near the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She was last seen in the parking lot talking to a brown-haired man with his arm in a sling. On June 11th, George Ann Hawkins, who was a student at the University of Washington, vanished while walking down a brightly lit alley between her boyfriend's dorm hall and her sorority house. Responding to a rash of disappearances, the police called for a major investigation. They enlisted a number of different government agencies to help look for the missing girls, and one of these agencies was the Washington State Department of Emergency Services. And this is where Bundy worked. This is where he met Carol Ann Boone, who was a twice divorced mother of two, and try to keep her in mind while we go through everything else. On July 14th, in broad daylight, 2 women were abducted from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish State Park. There were 5 female witnesses for this disappearance, and they all described an attractive young man wearing a white tennis outfit with his left arm in a sling. He was speaking in a light accent that they said was perhaps Canadian or British, and he introduced himself as Ted. He asked their help in unloading a sailboat from his car. 4 refused. One accompanied him as far as his car, saw that there was no sailboat, and fled. 3 additional witnesses saw him approach Janice Ann Ott, who was 23, with the sailboat story, and they watched her leave the beach in his company. And about 4 hours later, Denise Marie Naslund, who was a 19-year-old who was studying to become a computer programmer, left in a panic to go to the restroom and never returned. So on this day, Bundy got very ballsy. There were 8 witnesses on this day, and he took 2 ladies. Bundy later told reporters or whoever that Ott was still alive when he returned with Naslund, and he then forced one to watch as he murdered the other. King County Police posted flyers throughout the Seattle area, and a composite sketch was printed in regional newspapers and broadcasted on local television. And Elizabeth Klopfer, Ann Rule, a DES employee, and a University of Washington psychology professor all recognized the profile, the sketch, and the car, and reported Bundy as a possible suspect. But detectives, who were receiving up to 20 tips per day, thought it was unlikely that a clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record could be the perpetrator, which this just blows my mind, because 4 people called in with his name. And to one of the young women that he tried to talk to on the beach that day, he introduced himself as Ted. They knew his name was Ted. And 4 people are calling in with his name. But because he has no adult criminal record, it can't possibly be him. Like, when I read that, it just blew my mind. I don't understand how people can be so, like, is naive the right word? So now we're gonna fast forward just a little bit to August of 1974. Bundy got his second acceptance from the University of Utah Law School. He moved to Salt Lake City, leaving Klopfer behind in Seattle. And while in school, he dated at least a dozen other women, while Klopfer had absolutely no idea. And why she was still with him after she thought he might be a suspect and called in his name is beyond me. But while living there, Bundy continued to rape and murder a dozen other young women, which included a hitchhiker in Idaho and 4 teenage girls in Utah named Nancy Wilcox, Melissa Smith, Laura Aim, and Debbie Kent. Klopfer was aware that Bundy relocated to the area, and she called police a second time. But guess what? She still did not leave him. And like, I guess she might have been scared, but at this point he's in another state. Like, I don't get it. In January of 1975, Bundy returned to Seattle after his final exams and spent a week with Klopfer. She did not tell him that she reported him to police probably because she doesn't want to die as well. January 12th of that same year, a 23-year-old registered nurse named Karen Eileen Campbell disappeared while walking down a well-lit hallway between the elevator and her room at the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village, and her nude body was found a month later next to a dirt road outside of the resort. She had been killed by blows to her head and a blunt instrument that left distinctive linear groove depressions in her skull. Her body also bore deep cuts from a sharp weapon. On March 16th, ski instructor Julie Cunningham disappeared while walking from her apartment to a dinner date. She was approached by Bundy on crutches, and he asked her to help him carry his ski boots to his car, where he clubbed and handcuffed her, then assaulted and strangled her at a secondary site near Rifle, and he then made the 6-hour drive from Salt Lake City to later revisit her remains. And this is another one of the things that I don't understand, because he's on crutches. Why would he need help carrying ski boots? Why are you skiing on crutches? Is there something I don't know about skiing that would make this make sense? Because to me that doesn't make sense. On April 6th, a 25-year-old woman named Denise Lynn Ulverson disappeared on the Utah-Colorado border while riding her bike to her parents' house. Her bike and sandals were found under a viaduct near a railroad bridge. On May 6th, he lured 12-year-old Lynn Dawn Culver from Alameda Junior High School in Pocatello, Idaho, and he drowned and then sexually assaulted her in his hotel room before disposing of her body in the river north of Pocatello. On June 28th, Suzanne Curtis vanished from the campus of Birmingham Young University, but we don't really know much else about her. I couldn't really find much else about her. So, on August 16th, 1975 is when Bundy got arrested, and he actually got arrested for something completely unrelated to the murders. He was arrested by Utah Highway Patrol Officer Bob Hayward. Hayward had observed Bundy cruising a residential area in the pre-dawn hours, and Bundy fled after seeing the patrol car. The officer then pulled him over and searched the car, and he searched the car after he noticed that the front passenger seat of the Volkswagen had been removed and placed on the rear seats, which I didn't even know you could remove a front seat of a car, but whatever. He found a ski mask, a second mask fashioned from pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, trash bags, a coil of rope, an ice pick, and other items initially assumed to be burglary tools. Bundy explained that the ski mask was for skiing, that he found the handcuffs in a dumpster, and that the rest were common household items. I don't know about you, but I personally don't have a crowbar, a coil of rope, and an ice pick in my house, but that might just be me. It was then that Detective Jerry Thompson realized that Bundy was a suspect in the earlier killings. He put Bundy under surveillance, and they searched Bundy's apartment. The police found a guide to Colorado ski resorts with a check mark by the Wildwood Inn, which is where the one lady was murdered, and a brochure that advertised the Viewmont High School play where Deborah Kent had disappeared. The police did not have sufficient evidence, though, to detain Bundy, so Bundy was released. Bundy later said that the searchers missed an entire collection of Polaroid pictures that he had of his victims. He then destroyed the photographs after he was released. Salt Lake City placed Salt Lake City police placed Bundy on 24-hour surveillance. Thompson flew to Seattle with 2 other detectives to interview Klopfer. She told them that in the years prior to Bundy's move to Utah, she had discovered items that she couldn't understand in both her house and Bundy's apartment. These items included crutches, a bag of plaster, a meat cleaver that was never used for cooking, surgical gloves, an oriental knife in a wooden case that he kept in his glove compartment, and a sack full of women's clothing. Apparently, Bundy was very much in debt, and Klopfer suggested that everything of value that he owned he had actually stolen. When he confronted him over a new TV and stereo, he warned her, "If you tell anyone, I'll break your fucking neck." She said Bundy became very upset whenever she considered cutting her hair, which was long and parted down the middle, and she would wake up sometimes in the middle of the night to find him under the covers with a flashlight examining her body. He kept a lug wrench taped halfway up the handle in the trunk of her car, and he often borrowed it for protection. The detectives confirmed that Bundy had not been with Klopfer at any of the nights during which the victims had vanished, nor on the date Osland and Nat were abducted. Shortly after this, Klopfer had an interview by Seattle homicide detective Kathy McChesney, and this is when she found out about Brooks and that he was engaged to her. In September, Bundy sold his Volkswagen Beetle to a teenager. The Utah police impounded it and searched it. Well, FBI technicians dismantled and searched it, and they found hairs matching samples obtained from Karen Campbell's body. They also found hair strands that were microscopically indistinguishable from those of Melissa Smith and Carol DeRanch. FBI lab specialist Robert Neal, there's not an O in there, concluded that the presence of hair strands in one car matching 3 different victims that never met would be a coincidence of mind-boggling rarity. With this evidence, they then put Bundy in a lineup, and this is where he was identified by one of the women that he had attempted to assault the day at the beach, and he was convicted of kidnapping and assault. He was sent to prison, and this is when police went to build a murder case against him. And I am looking off my screen a lot, I know. It's because I did the research for this video over a year ago. So, on February 23rd, 1976, Bundy stood on trial for the kidnapping of DeRanch, and on the advice of his attorney, John O'Connell, Bundy waived his right to a jury due to the negative publicity surrounding the case. On March 1st, Judge Stuart Hanson Jr. found him guilty of kidnapping and assault. He was sentenced to serve a minimum of 1 to a maximum of 15 years in the Utah State Prison on June 30th. In October, I don't know the exact date, but in October he was found hiding in the bushes in the prison yard carrying an escape kit, which included road maps, airline schedules, a social security card, and he had spent several weeks in solitary confinement for this. Later that month, authorities charged him with Karen Campbell's murder, and he was then transferred to another prison in Aspen, Colorado in January of 1977. On June 7th, 1977, he was transferred from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs to the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, Colorado for a preliminary hearing. He had elected to serve as his own attorney, and he was excused by the judge from wearing handcuffs or leg shackles because he was presenting as his own attorney. and during a recess, he asked to visit the courthouse's law library to research his case. Bundy was concealed behind a bookcase. He opened a window and jumped from the second story. He sprained his right ankle as he landed, and after shedding an outer layer of clothing, he walked through Aspen as roadblocks were being set up on the outskirts. Then he hiked southwestward into the Aspen Mountains. Near its summit, he broke into a hunting cabin and stole food, clothing, and a rifle. On June 10th, he broke into a hunting trailer on Maroon Lake. He was taking food and a ski parka. Resources were scarce, so he scrapped his plan to vanish into the wilderness and decided to head back towards Aspen. 3 days later, he stole a car at the edge of the Aspen golf course. He was cold, sleep-deprived, and in constant pain from his ankle. He was pulled over by 2 police officers when they noticed his car weaving in and out of the lane, and he had been a fugitive for 6 days at this point. And in the car were maps of the mountain area around Aspen, which back in jail at Glenwood Springs, he ignored the advice of friends and legal advisors to stay put. Bundy's next escape took place just 6 months later from a jail cell. He had carefully studied the map of the prison, and he realized that his cell was directly beneath the living quarters of the prison's chief jailer. The 2 rooms were separated by only a small crawl space. Bundy traded with another inmate to get a small hacksaw and accumulated $500 in cash smuggled in over a 6-month period. And the cash was smuggled in by visitors, in particular Carol Ann Boone, which is a name I told you to remember, so hopefully you did. While his cellmates were exercising or showering, Bundy would work away at the ceiling, scraping away layer after layer of plaster, and he had lost 35 pounds just to fit into this very small crawl space. On the night of December 30th, most of the staff was out on Christmas break, and all of the non-violent prisoners were on furlough with their families. Bundy piled books and files in his bed, covered them with a blanket to simulate a sleeping body, and he crawled into the crawl space. He broke through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening with his wife. He changed into street clothes from the jailer's closet, and he just walked right out the front door. Just walked out the door. He immediately stole a car and then made his way to Florida. On January 8th, he arrived in Tallahassee, Florida. He rented a room under the alias Chris Hagen at a boarding house near the Florida State University campus, and he later said that he initially resolved to find legitimate employment and refrain from further criminal activity, knowing that he would probably remain free and undetected in Florida as long as he did not attract the attention of police. But his loan job application at a construction site had to be abandoned when he was asked to produce identification. On January 15th, 1978, 1 week after he arrived in Tallahassee, he entered Florida State University's Chi Omega sorority house through a rear door with a faulty locking mechanism. So he wasn't even there for a week before he failed at trying to live a normal life. At around 2:45 a.m., he bludgeoned Morgan Bowen, who was 21 years old, with a piece of oak firewood as she slept. He then garroted her with a nylon stocking. He then entered the bedroom of 20-year-old Lisa Levy and beat her unconscious, strangled her, tore off one of her nipples, bit deeply into her left buttocks, and sexually assaulted her with a hair mist bottle. In an adjoining bedroom, he went to attack Kathy Kleiner. He broke her jaw and deeply lacerated her shoulder. and Karen Chandler, who suffered a concussion, a broken jaw, and a crushed finger. Kathy Kleiner, who had only seen a silhouette of a man wielding a club, attributed her survival to the headlights of a car bringing Nina Neary back to the house, which lit up Kleiner and Chandler's room. Tallahassee detectives later determined that all 4 of these attacks took place and a total of less than 15 witnesses within earshot of more than 30 witnesses who heard absolutely nothing. After leaving the sorority house, Bundy broke into the basement apartment of another Florida University student named Cheryl Thomas. He dislocated her shoulder and fractured her jaw and skull in more than 5 places. She was left with permanent deafness and equilibrium damage that ended her dance career. On Thomas's bed, police found semen stains and a pantyhose mask containing 2 hairs similar to Bundy's in class and characteristic. Later, at Lake City Junior High School the following morning, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was summoned to her homeroom by a teacher to retrieve a forgotten purse. She never returned to class. Bundy had abducted her from her middle school and murdered her, concealing her body on a pig farm. February 12th, with insufficient cash to pay his overdue rent and a growing suspicion that police were closing in on him, Bundy stole a car and fled Tallahassee, driving westward across the Florida Panhandle. 3 days later, at around 1 a.m., he was stopped by Pensacola police officer David Lee near the Alabama state line after a once and warrants check showed that his Volkswagen Beetle was stolen. In the vehicle, they found 3 sets of IDs belonging to female Florida State University students, 21 stolen credit cards, and a stolen television set. Bundy stood trial for the Chi Omega homicides and assault in June 1979, and the trial was covered by 250 reporters from 5 continents. And this was, I think, the first to be televised nationally in the United States. Despite the presence of 5 court-appointed attorneys, Bundy again handled much of his own defense. A crucial testimony came from Chi Omega sorority members Connie Hastings, who placed Bundy in the vicinity of the Chi Omega sorority house that evening, and Nina Neary, who saw him leaving the sorority house clutching the oak murder weapon. Incriminating physical evidence included the bite wound on Lisa Levy's left buttocks. Forensic odontologist Richard Sovereign, probably pronouncing that wrong, and Laura Levine matched to castings of Bundy's teeth. A jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before convicting him on July 24th, 1979 of the Bowman and Levy murders, 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder for the assault on Kleiner, Chandler, and Thomas, and 2 counts of burglary. Trial Judge Edward Cowart imposed death sentences for the murder convictions. 6 months later, another trial took place for the abduction and murder of Kimberly Leach. Once again, Bundy was found guilty after less than 8 hours of deliberation, and important material evidence included clothing fibers with an unusual manufacturing error found in the van and on Leach's body, and the fibers matched the fibers of the jacket Bundy was wearing when he was arrested. During the penalty phase of the trial, Bundy took advantage of an obscure Florida law providing that a marriage declaration in court in front of the presence of a judge constituted a legal marriage. He was questioning former Washington State DES worker Carol Ann Boone. That's the one I said, keep the name on your mind. who had moved to Florida to be near Bundy because she was like in love with him and she really believed he was innocent. And Carol Ann Boone had testified on his behalf during both trials and was again testifying on his behalf as a character witness. He asked her to marry him. She accepted, and Bundy declared to the court they were legally married. On February 10th, 1980, Bundy was sentenced for a third time to death by electrocution. He reportedly stood and shouted, "Tell the jury they were wrong." This third death sentence was the one that was ultimately carried out 9 years later. In October of 1981, Carol Ann Boone gave birth to a daughter and named Bundy as the father. So shortly after the conclusion of the Leach trial and the beginning of the long appeals process that followed, Bundy initiated a series of interviews with Stephen McCaud and Hugh Ainsworth. He spoke mostly in third person, and he did this because he wanted to avoid the stigma of confession. He didn't want to say, "Oh, I did this." He would say like, "Oh, he did this," or "Ted did this." He would never speak in first person when talking about confession and things that he did. He began for the first time to divulge details of the crimes and thought processes, and he recounted his career as a thief, confirming Klopfer's longtime suspicion that he had shoplifted most of the things that he owned that were of some sort of value. And this is a quote directly from Bundy. He said, "The big payoff for me was actually possessing whatever it was that I had stolen. I really enjoyed having something that I had wanted and gone out and taken. Possession proved to be an important motive for rape as well as murder." He said that sexual assault fulfilled his need to totally possess his victims, and later said that murder was just to eliminate the possibility of being caught. Later, murder became part of the adventure. This is another direct quote from him. "The ultimate possession was, in fact, the taking from life, and then the physical possession of the remains." So, if you haven't figured it out by now, Bundy's a pretty fucked up dude, and I'm gonna go off camera to finish my mascara. Hagmaier said that he was struck by the deep, almost mystical satisfaction that Bundy took from murder. He said that after a while, murder is not just a crime of lust or violence. It becomes possession. They are a part of you. The victim becomes a part of you, and you two are forever one. And the grounds where you killed them or leave them become sacred to you, and you will always be drawn back to them. Bundy said that he considered himself to be an amateur until he reached his prime or predator phase at about the time of Linda Healy's death in 1974. In July of 1984, 2 hacksaw blades that Bundy had hidden in his cell were found. A steel bar in one of the cell's windows had been sawed completely through at the top and bottom and glued back into place with a homemade soap-based adhesive. Several months later, guards found an unauthorized mirror hidden in the cell. Bundy was again moved to a different cell. Sometime during this period, Bundy was attacked by a group of fellow death row inmates, and though he denied ever being assaulted, a number of inmates confessed to the crime, characterized by one source as a gang rape. Oh my God. In early 1986, an execution date of March 4th was set on the Chi Omega convictions, but was rescheduled. In April, shortly after the new date, July 2nd, was announced. Bundy finally confessed to Hagmaier and Nelson what they believed was the full range of his depredations, including details of what he did to some of the victims after their deaths. He told Hagmaier and Nelson that he would revisit the crime scenes often several times to lie with the victims and perform sexual acts with their decomposing bodies. In some cases, he would drive for several hours each way and remain the entire night. In Utah, he applied makeup to Melissa Smith's face, and he repeatedly washed Laura Ames' hair. "If you've got time," he told Hagmaier, "they can be anything you want them to be." He decapitated approximately 12 of his victims with a hacksaw and kept at least one group of severed heads in his apartment for a period of time before disposing of them. Less than 15 hours before the July 2nd execution date, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals stayed it indefinitely and remanded the Chi Omega case for review on multiple technicalities, including Bundy's mental ability to stand trial. A new date, November 18, 1986, was then set to carry out the Leach sentence. The 11th Court Circuit issued a stay on November 17th. In mid-1988, the 11th Court Circuit ruled against Bundy, and in December, the Supreme Court denied a motion to review the ruling. Within hours of that final decision, a firm execution date of January 24th, 1989 was announced. Bundy confessed to Keppel that he had committed all 8 of the Washington and Oregon homicides for which he was the prime suspect. He described 3 additional previously unknown victims in Washington and 2 in Oregon whom he declined to identify. He said he left a 5th corpse, Donna Manson's, on Taylor Mountain, but incinerated her head in Liz Kupfer's fireplace. Bundy confessed to detectives of Colorado, Idaho, and Utah that he had committed numerous additional homicides, including several that were unknown to the police. Bundy had a new strategy. His main desire now was to postpone his execution date, and he did this by constantly saying that he was the only one who knew the true resting place of his victims, in hopes that they would postpone it to get more information. When it became clear that no further stays would be coming from the courts, Bundy supporters began lobbying for the only remaining option, executive clemency. Diane Weiner, a young Florida attorney, asked the families of several Colorado victims and Utah victims to petition Florida Governor Bob Martinez for a postponement to give Bundy time to reveal all information. All of them refused. The families were already believed that the victims were dead and that Ted had killed them, and they did not need his confession. Martinez made it clear that he would not agree to any further delays in the case. And like I said earlier, Carol Ann Boone really thought that Bundy was innocent all throughout his trials and felt deeply betrayed by his admission that he was, in fact, guilty. She moved back to Washington with her daughter and refused to accept his phone call on the day that he was executed. She was hurt by his relationship with Diana, Nelson wrote, and devastated by his sudden wholesale confessions in his last days. She was hurt that Bundy lied to her the entire time and said that he was innocent, but then Diana came along and he just admitted everything to her. Hagmaier was present during Bundy's final interviews with investigators on the eve of his execution, and he talked of suicide. He did not want to give the state satisfaction of watching him die, Hagmaier said. Ted Bundy was executed by electric chair on January 24th, 1989 at 7:16 a.m. He was 42 years old. Hundreds of people sang, danced, and set off fireworks in a field across the street from where the prison was. Then they all cheered loudly as the white hearse containing his body left the prison. His body was cremated in Gainesville, and his ashes were scattered at an undisclosed location in the Cascade Range of Washington State in accordance to his will. Ted Bundy had confessed to over 30 murders, though specialists believe that there were many more that he never confessed to. That's the end of the video on Ted Bundy. It was a long one, I know. If you guys have any suggestions for videos, link them down below. Leave them down below. I did read off the screen a lot just because this one was so long. I had like 16 pages of information, and my camera died through it and my laptop died through it, and it's just been a mess. I had to like take a break for like 2 hours so that everything could charge. But yeah, I hope you guys found this interesting, and I hope you guys liked my video. I did try to get as much correct information as possible, though some things were still left unknown, obviously. Man, it's messed up right there. Anyway, leave suggestions down below. All of my social media will be linked down below. If you guys have any idea what to call this series, because I need a name for it, because I plan on doing it a lot with like the makeup and the true crime, but I need a name that's like all encompassing for true crime and serial killers and missing persons cases and cold cases and da 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 da. Anyway, if you have any suggestions for a name for this series, link that down below as well. And if you want to know anything that I used on my face, that will all be in the description box. And that is all for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Bye!